If you had asked me years ago what I wanted out of life, it wasn't this. My name is Gavin Turner, and at 32 years old, I stood on a life built on someone else's blueprint. Dreams I once chased like fireflies gone. The music that used to pour out of me, that lit up my veins and gave meaning to my long, restless nights, that was buried beneath piles of bank statements and quarterly reports. I hadn't grown up picturing myself in a glass tower, crunching numbers, selling my hours to clients who would forget my name the moment they got what they wanted. I grew up dreaming of stages, of guitars slung over my shoulder, of crowds swaying under the dim haze of stage lights while I lost myself in the chords and the chaos. I dreamed of living a life that felt alive. But life, real life, they said, wasn't built on guitars and late nights. It was built on stability, on income, on plans. Clarissa used to look at me with those brilliant, stormy eyes and say, "I believe in your passion, Gavin." Back when we were younger, back when promises tasted like sugar and felt like freedom. But after the rings were exchanged and the ink dried on the marriage certificate, the tune changed. It was subtle at first, a quiet frown when I mentioned an open mic night, a tight smile when I spent too long tinkering with my guitar in the evenings. Then came the talks. "We're not kids anymore," she said once, standing by the window of our tiny apartment, arms folded, her silhouette cut sharp against the setting sun. "We have responsibilities." Responsibilities. Such a heavy word for a dreamer like me. But I wanted her. I wanted us. I wanted to be the man who could give her the life she deserved. So I traded my strings for spreadsheets. I tucked away the wild, messy parts of myself that didn't fit neatly into her world of curated brunches, holiday parties, and 5-year financial plans. I thought if I worked hard enough, smiled wide enough, brought in enough money, I could buy my way into the heart of the future she envisioned. I thought love was about sacrifice. I didn't realize I was the only one sacrificing. Clarissa's family, Dolores, Richard, and Mallory, welcomed me the way a museum might welcome a stray cat. Smiles stretched thin, voices dripping with politeness so sweet it made my teeth ache. They admired my suits, not my spirit. They praised my promotions, not my perseverance. I wasn't a son-in-law. I was an accessory. A box checked off. Another piece in their meticulously structured lives. Still, I clung to hope. I thought if I kept showing up, kept providing, kept smoothing down the rough edges of who I was, they'd see me. Really see me. Maybe even love me. Or at least respect me. But with every passing year, it became harder to ignore the truth. Clarissa wasn't holding my hand on the journey anymore. She was pulling me behind her like a stubborn piece of luggage, useful only for the weight I carried. It was in the way she spoke to me, always a little sharper when her mother was in the room. It was in the way Dolores and Richard would chuckle when I said something that didn't fit their perfect narrative. It was in the way Mallory barely looked at me, like even acknowledging my presence was a chore. And yet, I stayed. I stayed because that's what love does, right? It endures. It forgives. It believes. That's what I told myself, anyway, until the day they left me behind without a second thought. I remember standing by the front window, watching their black SUVs pull out of the driveway, the morning sun glinting off polished chrome. Clarissa in the front seat, her laughter ringing faintly through the closed glass. Dolores adjusting her sunglasses. Richard barking orders into his phone. Mallory flipping through a glossy travel magazine, her blonde hair glinting like a halo. Not one of them looked back at the house. At me. I was just the background noise, the safe, steady placeholder tasked with holding their world together while they chased sunsets in Hawaii. And Sophie, poor Sophie, left behind like a piece of furniture too cumbersome to take along. Clarissa had kissed my cheek, perfunctory and cold, and said, "You don't mind staying with her, right? It's just for a week. You're good at these things. Good at these things." Like I was the hired help. Like staying behind with a silent, broken girl was my duty as the one who didn't need a vacation. There wasn't even a thank you. As the taillights disappeared down the road, the house fell into a cavernous silence. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, letting out a slow breath. It was funny, in a sick kind of way. All my sacrifices. All the hours spent grinding my soul down to fit into their shiny, polished world. And when the time came to chase joy, to bask in the life I helped build, they left me behind without a second thought. I wasn't a partner. I was a tool. I turned away from the window, the ache deep and raw inside me. Clarissa's perfume still clung to the air, some expensive floral scent that made my chest tighten. I pushed it away. I pushed her away. For the first time in a long time, I let the thought creep in fully, brutally. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe the life I built wasn't mine at all. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to take it back. Clarissa's family wasn't a family in the way I had once imagined a family should be. It was a fortress, stone walls, high gates, and a moat filled with silent judgments. Dolores, the matriarch, ruled it with a delicate iron fist, always smiling sweetly as she cut you down. Richard, her husband, wasn't much better, a man who measured others by the size of their bank accounts and the quality of their suits. Mallory, Clarissa's younger sister, mirrored their coldness, though she wore hers like a designer jacket, fashionable, effortless, and utterly heartless. And then there was Sophie. Sophie, Mallory's daughter, barely spoke, barely moved. 14 years old and confined to a bed in the east wing of the sprawling house, her world narrowed to the four corners of a dimly lit room. They said she had fallen ill when she was 10, some mysterious, unnamed condition that left her weak and bedridden. Dolores spoke about her like a tragic story she kept polished for sympathy points at her charity luncheons. Mallory posed with Sophie in smiling holiday photos, artfully arranged to hide the girl's pale complexion and the empty stare in her eyes. Richard, when he mentioned her at all, called her the poor thing, like she was some distant inconvenience. To me, she was the only real soul in that cold, cavernous house. I often sat by her bedside while Clarissa and the others busied themselves with fundraisers and garden parties. I would talk to her about simple things, the weather, music I used to play, funny things I saw on the news. She rarely responded, just blinking those wide, weary eyes at the ceiling. But every so often, I caught a flicker, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, a glance that lingered a second too long. Signs that somewhere behind the frail mask, Sophie was still there. Dolores never liked me spending too much time with Sophie. "You're not trained for that kind of care," she'd sniff, like conversation was a dangerous drug. Richard would grumble about boundaries and roles, making it clear that as far as they were concerned, I was useful only when I stayed invisible. And Clarissa didn't even pretend anymore. Sophie wasn't her concern. She was Mallory's responsibility, an unfortunate burden Clarissa was too important, too busy to bother with. When Clarissa asked me to stay behind and watch over Sophie while they jetted off to Hawaii, it wasn't a favor. It wasn't even a request. It was a command wrapped in false gratitude. "You're so dependable," Clarissa had said, her voice honey-sweet but hollow. "You're perfect for this. Perfect for being left behind. Perfect for cleaning up after the life they didn't want to see when they were sipping cocktails on the beach." I didn't argue. I didn't protest. What would have been the point? In Clarissa's mind, and certainly in Dolores and Richard's, my role was already cemented. I was the caretaker, the errand boy, the loyal fixture who smiled and nodded and made their perfect world easier. The morning after they left, the house felt bigger than ever. Every clock ticked louder. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like a cannon shot. The sunlight that filtered through the long windows was pale and cold, doing nothing to chase away the heavy emptiness. I patted down the marble hallway to Sophie's room, the tray of breakfast rattling slightly in my hands. I knew the drill: small meals, bland food, little conversation. That was the routine they insisted on. When I pushed open the door, the familiar sight met me: Sophie curled under her thin blanket, her face turned toward the window, her body so still she could have been made of porcelain. I set the tray down gently, pulling a chair up beside her bed. "Good morning, Sophie," I said, keeping my voice soft, like you might with a skittish animal. "I made you some oatmeal. And apple slices. Thought you might like something fresh." No response. I sighed and leaned back, feeling the old frustration flicker in my chest. Not at her. Never at her. At the situation. At the cruelty of it all. Outside, the world carried on, normal, vibrant, messy. And inside this room, a young life was withering away under heavy velvet drapes and the constant hum of a medical monitor. I thought about Dolores's lectures, about Richard's sneers, about Clarissa's empty kisses and colder silences. And I realized this was how they wanted it. Sophie trapped, me neutered, everyone slotted neatly into roles that served the fortress. I rubbed a hand over my face, the stubble scratching against my palm. How had I gotten here? How had I gone from a man who dreamed in music and color to someone who was grateful just to be tolerated? A knock at the door broke my thoughts. It was Maria, the housekeeper, slipping in with fresh linens. She gave me a small, tight smile, The kind of smile you wore when survival depended on silence. Mr. Turner, she said politely, nodding to Sophie. Everything okay? I nodded back, forcing a smile. Yeah, thanks, Maria. She lingered for half a second longer than necessary, her eyes flicking towards Sophie with something like pity. Then she turned and disappeared down the hall, the door clicking softly shut behind her. I looked back at Sophie. At the girl no one really saw anymore. You're not alone, I said quietly, not even sure if she could hear me. I know it feels like it, but you're not. Her hand twitched then, so slightly I almost missed it. Hope, foolish and fragile, stirred in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to Sophie than they wanted me to believe. Maybe there was more to this life than the prison they had built for both of us. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and waited. Not for permission. Not for approval. I waited for the moment Sophie would finally show me who she really was. And deep down, I knew. I was waiting for the moment my own life would start again, too. The house was unnervingly quiet after they left. Even the grandfather clock in the foyer seemed hesitant to chime, as if it too understood that something had shifted. I wandered through the rooms, feeling like a ghost haunting a mansion I didn't belong to anymore. No Clarissa, barking orders between sips of green juice. No Dolores, bustling around with self-importance. No Richard's booming, self-satisfied laughter filling up all the empty spaces. Just me. And Sophie. I carried a fresh glass of water to her room, a book tucked under my arm. I figured I would read to her for a while, anything to make the day pass a little easier. I wasn't sure if she liked it, if she even heard half of what I said, but it felt right to offer her something more than silence. She deserved better than being treated like a piece of forgotten furniture. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The dim light inside painted everything in soft gray. Sophie lay in bed exactly as I had left her, her small frame swallowed by the large mattress, her arms limp at her sides. Her face was pale, almost translucent, like a porcelain doll left too long in the dark. I set the water down carefully on the nightstand and adjusted the pillows behind her head. It was a familiar routine by now. Lift gently, support her weight, make sure she stayed comfortable. I murmured small reassurances out of habit, not expecting a response. But then, just as I was about to pull my hands away, Sophie moved. It wasn't a twitch or a spasm. It was deliberate. Her arms pushed against the mattress. Her legs swung over the side of the bed. And before I could even process what was happening, she was sitting upright, feet dangling, her body trembling slightly but unmistakably alive. I stumbled back, almost knocking over the water glass. Sophie, I gasped. She lifted her head and looked at me. Not past me. Not through me. At me. Her eyes, once dull and unfocused, were sharp now. Bright. Terrified, yes, but alive with something fierce and determined. Her voice, when it came, was dry and raspy but full of purpose. They want my $10 million, she said. Please help me. The world tilted. I gripped the edge of the nightstand to steady myself, the words echoing inside my skull. $10 million? Help me? What the hell was happening? I stared at her, mouth opening and closing like a fool, trying to make sense of it. For years, they had presented her as this broken, helpless child, too weak even to sit up. A fragile thing requiring constant supervision and endless pity. And now, here she was, alive, alert, and asking for help with more clarity than I had heard from anyone in this house in years. They what? I finally stammered. Sophie glanced toward the door, her small hands curling into fists on the blanket. They don't care about me, she said. They care about the trust fund my grandfather left me. They want it. They've been keeping me like this, so they can control it. Control me. I sat down heavily in the chair by her bed, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. This couldn't be real. It sounded like the plot of some twisted movie, not the quiet, monotonous life I had been trudging through day after day. But then again, hadn't there always been something off? The way Dolores hovered, always fussing but never comforting. The way Richard talked about Sophie like a burden. The way Mallory smiled too brightly in public and disappeared at home. The way Clarissa treated caring for her niece like a favor she was too good to be burdened with. And me, left behind, trusted enough to watch over a girl they thought too drugged and weak to do anything but lie still. I looked at Sophie, really looked at her. She was trembling from the effort of sitting up, her thin arms taut with strain. But there was a fire in her eyes, a fierce, desperate will to survive that no sedative could smother. How long have you been like this? I asked quietly. More than a year, she whispered. Getting stronger. little by little. But if they knew, if they found out. Her voice broke, and she swallowed hard. They do something worse. My fists clenched. Anger, cold and heavy, pooled in my gut. These people, these monsters, had kept her imprisoned in her own body for years, all for money. They paraded her around for sympathy and charity donations, whispered behind closed doors about poor, sweet Sophie, while they plotted to steal her future. And I had been part of it. Unwitting, but part of it all the same. I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a fierce whisper. I believe you, I said. And I'll help you. I swear it. For the first time, the tiniest flicker of a smile touched Sophie's lips. It wasn't happiness, it was relief. A shared understanding between two prisoners who had found, at last, an escape plan. But even as I made that promise, a dark question gnawed at the back of my mind. What would they do to both of us if they found out? I pushed it away. I would figure that out later. Right now, there was only one truth that mattered. Sophie was alive. She needed me. And I was done being the man who stood by while evil wore a polite smile. I reached out and took her trembling hand in mine, squeezing it gently. We'll get you out of this, I said. I don't know how yet, but I promise we will. For the first time in years, I felt something stir in my chest. Not fear, not resignation. Hope. A dangerous, precious thing. And I knew I wasn't just saving her. She was saving me too. Sophie's words echoed in my mind long after the room fell silent. They want my $10 million. The truth of it buzzed in the air around me, vibrating against every wall, rattling against everything I thought I knew. I sat there, staring at her, this girl I had pitied for so long, realizing that she wasn't the broken, helpless thing they'd made her out to be. She was strong, impossibly strong, and she'd been hiding it, waiting for someone who might actually see her. Someone who could help. I was that someone. Carefully, I eased the door shut, as though even the creak of a hinge might give us away. Sophie watched me with wide, wary eyes, like a cornered animal unsure if it could trust the hand being offered. I crossed the room and sat down again, closer this time, lowering my voice into a whisper. Tell me everything, I said. All of it. No holding back. Sophie nodded, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. She tucked a strand of limp hair behind her ear and took a shaky breath before she started speaking. My grandfather, my real grandfather, not Richard, he was the only person who ever cared about me, she said, her voice raw. When he died, he left a trust fund for me. $10 million, set aside until I turned 18. I nodded slowly. I'd heard vague mentions of her late grandfather before, but no one ever spoke about him much. It was as if his memory had been quietly erased from the Turner family history. Now I understood why he was the last threat to their control. The money was supposed to be managed carefully, she continued. Only for emergencies. Healthcare. Education. Grandpa didn't trust Mallory, or Dolores, or Richard. He didn't trust anyone except the lawyer he appointed. What happened? I asked. Sophie clenched her fists in her lap, her knuckles going white. They found a way around it. They bribed doctors. They got people to say I was too sick to manage anything myself, that I needed round-the-clock care. They presented a case to the court that I was permanently incapacitated, and the court gave temporary guardianship over my trust to Dolores under special circumstances. Special circumstances. I almost choked on the words. They keep me drugged, Sophie said, her voice breaking. Not enough to kill me. Just enough to make me compliant. Confused. Tired all the time. They told everyone it was my illness. She laughed bitterly, a hollow, broken sound. There's no illness. The anger inside me wasn't just a fire now. It was a roaring inferno. I thought back to every slow, slurred word from Sophie, every blank stare, every limp movement, and now I saw it for what it was. Not sickness. Not weakness. A prison they built out of pills and needles and lies. And the worst part? She whispered. They talk about it. Right here. In this house. They think I'm too far gone to understand. But I hear them. I hear everything. I lean closer. Why now? Why trust me? Sophie looked at me for a long moment, measuring the weight of my question, the risk of her answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but certain. Because you're the only one they don't see as a threat, she said. They think you're weak. Useless. Disposable. I flinched at the truth of it, but I nodded. She wasn't wrong. They didn't fear me. They barely even noticed me. And that was exactly why I had an advantage they hadn't accounted for. How long have you been pretending? I asked. A year, she said. It started small. I stopped taking all the pills they gave me, hid them under my tongue, spat them out when no one was looking. I started moving my fingers again, then my arms. I built my strength up, little by little, but I never let them see it. Her hands clenched again. I was waiting for the right time, waiting for someone, for anyone, who might help me. I reached across the space between us and took her hand gently in mine. "You're not alone anymore," I said. "We'll fix this." For the first time, real tears filled Sophie's eyes, and she gave a small, shaky nod. We sat there in the heavy silence, both of us knowing the danger that now surrounded us. If Clarissa, Dolores, Richard, or Mallory ever found out that Sophie was stronger than they believed, if they even suspected she was plotting against them, they wouldn't just ramp up the sedation. They would find a way to silence her permanently. And if they knew I was involved? I didn't want to think about what they'd do. I squeezed Sophie's hand once, firmly, anchoring her, and myself, to the decision we had just made without even speaking it aloud. We were going to fight back. "Tomorrow," I said quietly. "Tomorrow, we'll start planning. But for tonight, we keep everything normal. We don't give them a reason to be suspicious." Sophie nodded. "Okay." I stood, pulling the covers gently up over her again. If anyone walked in, they would see only a fragile, bedridden girl and a dutiful, useless husband hovering nearby. They would see what they expected to see. That was our greatest weapon now, their arrogance. I walked toward the door, pausing just before I opened it. "Sophie," I said, glancing back over my shoulder. "I'm proud of you. I'm proud you fought. And I promise you, this ends with you free." Her eyes glistened, but she smiled, a real smile this time, small but defiant. And for the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a lie. It felt like a battle cry. We didn't waste time. The moment the sun crept through the curtains the next morning, Sophie and I got to work, moving carefully, methodically, like soldiers preparing for a war that no one could know was coming. Every step had to be hidden beneath layers of normalcy. If Dolores or Richard ever caught even a whiff of what we were doing, it would be over. First, we tackled surveillance. I drove into town under the excuse of needing groceries and supplies, a normal enough errand for a man supposedly tending a sick girl. But instead of just milk and bread, I picked up tiny security cameras, voice-activated recorders, and a few burner phones from a grimy electronics store wedged between a pawn shop and a vape shop. The clerk barely looked up as I paid in cash, which suited me just fine. Back at the house, Sophie and I worked quickly, choosing our spots with precision. A small camera hidden inside a vent in Dolores and Richard's upstairs office. A second tucked behind a stack of books on the massive bookshelf, facing the heavy oak desk where they conducted their whispered conversations. Another tucked under the lip of a kitchen cabinet, angled perfectly to catch the daily meetings they held over coffee, gossiping and scheming as if Sophie wasn't lying just a few doors down. It was strange how easy it was. How practiced I became at deceit once I understood the stakes. Next came audio. We placed tiny recorders inside fake potted plants, nestled between dusty faux leaves. Another inside a hollowed-out dictionary no one had touched in decades. Sophie, despite the toll it took on her still-recovering body, insisted on helping. Her hands shook as she pressed one of the recorders into a crack in the baseboard behind Dolores's desk, but she gritted her teeth and did it anyway. "I have to," she said, catching my worried glance. "If they find just you in the middle of this, they'll bury you. We do this together." There was steel in her voice, and for the first time, I saw not just a survivor but a fighter. We set up a private communications system too. The burner phones were programmed with just one number, each other's. No texts. Only calls if absolutely necessary, and never from the same location twice. Sophie hid hers in a hollowed-out teddy bear on her dresser. I kept mine duct-taped under the frame of my car's passenger seat. As each day passed, we moved like shadows through the house, careful not to disturb the surface of the illusion the family expected to see. I served Sophie meals, adjusted her pillows, read to her when Maria passed by the door. We whispered plans behind closed curtains and burned our handwritten notes after every conversation, watching the ashes swirl up the fireplace like silent promises. We needed more than just gossip and vague accusations. We needed proof, concrete, damning evidence that no lawyer could smooth over, no publicist could spin. So we listened. And slowly, the truth began to slither out from the walls. One evening, hidden in my room, I played back the recording from the vent camera. "As soon as she turns 18, it'll be ours," Dolores's voice purred, thick with greed. We'll have access to everything, Richard added. The trust, the properties. All we have to do is make sure she stays sick a little longer. Keep her quiet, compliant. That lawyer's still sniffing around, Mallory's voice chimed in. The one Grandpa liked. We need to make sure she doesn't talk to anyone outside. No visitors. No changes. And then, Clarissa, my own wife, cold and calculating, adding with a laugh, if she accidentally gets worse, well, that's a risk we're willing to take. I sat there in the dark, the bile rising in my throat. There it was, laid out in their own voices. Conspiracy. Abuse. Fraud. Attempted murder, even, if you squinted at it the right way. We weren't just gathering evidence anymore. We were building the noose they would hang themselves with. Sophie, curled up on the floor beside me, listened in grim silence. When the recording ended, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply looked at me and said, "We have to move faster." And she was right. We called the trust lawyer next, Ms. Helena Brooks, the one Sophie's grandfather had appointed all those years ago. Of course, we didn't use our real phones. I drove 3 towns over, found a grimy old payphone outside a laundromat, and dialed her number. Helena answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and professional. I introduced myself, explaining in careful, cautious terms that I was reaching out about Sophie Turner and that there was urgent evidence she needed to see. At first, she was skeptical. Years of dealing with Dolores and Richard had made her wary. But when I mentioned a specific clause in the trust, one Sophie had whispered to me in the dead of night, memorized from a letter her grandfather once wrote. Helena's tone changed. "You have proof?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "and we're prepared to act. But we need help." There was a pause so long I thought the line had gone dead. Then Helena said, "I'll be there in a week." 1 week. 7 days to gather every scrap of evidence, to build an unbreakable case. 7 days to tear down a fortress years in the making. We ended the call. I stood under the flickering laundromat light for a long moment, breathing in the smell of detergent and dust, letting the weight of what we were doing settle in my chest. Then I drove home. Sophie was waiting by the window when I returned, her small frame barely outlined in the darkness. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. I nodded once. We were all in. And the clock had just started ticking. The days that followed blurred together, a dizzying race against a clock we could no longer see but could feel, ticking louder and faster with every passing hour. Clarissa and her family were still in Hawaii, flashing their curated smiles for the camera, throwing up peace signs in front of turquoise waves, their arms wrapped around each other like the perfect portrait of happiness. Every new photo they posted was like a twisted insult, the caption "family over everything" scrawled beneath images of people who had systematically destroyed one of their own. I scrolled through their posts late at night, studying the details the way a detective would study a crime scene. Who was in the background? Were they distracted? Were they suspicious yet? Nothing. Their smiles were still real, their drinks still colorful, their betrayal still blissfully ignorant of the storm brewing in their absence. Meanwhile, Sophie and I moved like soldiers on enemy ground. We spent the mornings cross-referencing bank statements we had managed to access from old records hidden in Richard's office. Forged medical records. Lists of non-existent treatments and inflated hospital bills were photographed and backed up to hidden drives. Transfer receipts for private spending siphoned discreetly from Sophie's trust account. Vacations, designer clothes, cosmetic surgeries stacked higher than I could stomach. The evidence was no longer just strong. It was damning. Each night, we double-checked the cameras, reviewed the recordings, sorted through every scrap of conversation caught on audio. Every lie, every scheme, every careless whisper they thought no one could hear. And yet, despite our progress, a current of fear still pulled at me constantly, an invisible undertow. I could see it in Sophie too. The way her shoulders stiffened at every unexpected creak of the house. The way her eyes darted toward the front door whenever Maria knocked too loudly delivering clean sheets or meals. The way she barely slept, her body coiled tight even in her dreams. We were so close to freeing her. So close to tearing them down. And then Dolores called. It was a Thursday afternoon, cloudy and cold. I was in the kitchen wiping down the counters, another small performance for the security cameras I knew Dolores and Richard would review upon their return. My phone buzzed sharply against the marble countertop. I glanced down and froze. It was Dolores. Heart hammering against my ribs, I answered as casually as I could, forcing a cheerful tone into my voice. "Hello, Dolores." "Gavin," she said, her voice clipped, brisk. "Change of plans. We're flying back early. I swallowed hard. Oh, everything okay? There was a pause, the faint sound of waves and wind and what might have been Richard barking in the background. Nothing to worry about, Dolores said dismissively. We just decided we'd rather come home and relax than spend another day dealing with tourists. We'll be landing tomorrow night. Tomorrow night. My blood turned cold. We had expected another full day. Another precious 24 hours to lock everything down, to make sure Helena had everything she needed. Now, the window was closing. Fast. Of course, I said, voice steady by sheer will alone. I'll make sure everything's ready for you. Good, Dolores said, her tone dripping with entitlement. I expect the house spotless. And make sure Sophie looks presentable if she's up. The doctor's coming to do another evaluation. Understood, I said, and hung up before she could hear the crack in my voice. I stood there for a moment, gripping the counter until my knuckles whitened, letting the reality of it crash over me. They were coming. Early. We had less than 24 hours. I raced upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time, and burst into Sophie's room. She was sitting by the window, knees drawn up to her chest, staring out into the gray sky. She turned at the sound of the door, and one look at my face told her everything. They're coming back, she whispered. Tomorrow night, I confirmed. We just lost a day. Panic flared in her eyes, but she tamped it down quickly, setting her jaw in that stubborn, defiant way I was beginning to admire more than anything. Then we move faster, she said. I sat down on the edge of her bed, raking a hand through my hair. We have to be perfect, Sophie. Every document, every file, every recording. We have to have it ready to hand over to Helena the moment she steps through the door. And we have to act like nothing's wrong, she said, nodding grimly. Exactly. We spent the next 12 hours in a frantic, silent rhythm, copying files to 3 separate backup drives, hiding one in the hollowed-out base of a lamp, another inside an old box of board games, the third taped behind the water heater in the basement. Every scrap of evidence was scanned, photographed, encrypted, and hidden in places no casual glance would find. I coached Sophie through what we would say if Dolores or Richard questioned her. How to fake weakness. How to keep her breathing shallow. How to nod off at the right moments to make them believe the drugs were still working. I hated it. I hated that she had to crawl back into that prison even for a moment. But it was the only way. We had to survive the next 24 hours. Just one day. One more day. At midnight, we sat together in the dim light of her room, utterly exhausted but wired with adrenaline. Outside, the wind howled against the glass, rattling the windows in their frames. Do you think we'll make it? Sophie asked quietly. I turned to her, seeing not the fragile girl they thought she was, but the warrior she had become. We don't have a choice, I said. We're not just surviving anymore, Sophie. We're winning. And in the pit of my gut, beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the aching anger, I believed it. We were winning. They just didn't know it yet. The night before their arrival was a restless one. Sleep came in broken pieces, slipping through my fingers like water. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind tapping against the windows had me sitting upright in bed, heart pounding, convinced they were already here, convinced we'd run out of time. When the morning finally arrived, it was with a heavy gray sky and an air so thick with tension it felt like breathing soup. Sophie and I went through the house one final time, making sure everything was exactly as they left it. No clue, no scent, no trace of our rebellion. The cameras remained hidden, the recorders untouched in their safe little nests. It had to be perfect. By late afternoon, Sophie was back in her bed, dressed in one of the pale, washed-out nightgowns Clarissa insisted she wear, the color chosen specifically to emphasize her supposed frailty. I helped arrange her pillows, brushed her hair gently, even dabbed a little cool water on her forehead to give her skin that slightly clammy sheen they'd expect. I hate this, she whispered as I pulled the blanket up around her. I know, I said, but it's just one more show. Then it's over. She gave a small, determined nod. I stood by the window, watching the driveway, counting the minutes, my hands curled into tight fists at my sides. At exactly 7:30, headlights swept across the lawn. A sleek black SUV pulled into the circular drive, tires crunching softly against the gravel. Doors slammed. Laughter, loud, obnoxious, familiar, echoed across the front yard. They were home. I turned to Sophie, my voice low. Remember, stay small, stay quiet. She nodded again, closing her eyes, slipping into the mask they expected to see. I headed downstairs, heart hammering against my ribs, face carefully blank. I pasted on the neutral, obedient smile they knew so well, the one I'd worn for years without even realizing it had become my armor. The front door burst open. Dolores stormed in first, her designer sunglasses perched on her head, a silk scarf tied neatly around her neck. Richard followed, dragging 2 large suitcases behind him, barking orders about someone needing to clean the car immediately. Mallory trailed behind them, tapping away at her phone, her tan lines still visible beneath her overpriced sundress. And Clarissa, my wife. She walked in last, her golden hair tousled artfully by the island breeze, her skin glowing, her lips curved into a smug little smile that evaporated the moment she saw me standing there. I saw the flicker of confusion cross her face. Something wasn't right. Something was different. But she pushed it away quickly, laughing lightly as she dropped her bag at my feet like I was the hired help. "We're home," she announced, as if it were some grand event. "Welcome back," I said evenly, stepping aside so they could sweep past me into the house. Dolores barely spared me a glance as she pulled off her scarf and tossed it onto the nearest armchair. "Is Sophie awake?" she demanded. "Resting," I replied smoothly. "She's had a quiet week." Richard grunted. "Good. She needs to stay quiet. Doctor's coming tomorrow to reevaluate her case." Clarissa smiled coldly at that, a sharp, satisfied expression that made my stomach churn. "Hopefully we can wrap this whole thing up soon," she said. "It's time to start thinking about the future." The way she said it, the future, it wasn't a dream. It was a prize. Something they planned to seize the moment Sophie's usefulness ran out. I kept my mouth shut, forcing my fingers to relax at my sides. Let them think they were still in control. Dolores turned to me sharply. "Well, don't just stand there. Go check on Sophie." "Of course," I said, ducking my head obediently, retreating up the stairs. I didn't look back. In Sophie's room, she lay perfectly still, breathing slow and shallow. For a terrifying moment, she looked so convincingly frail I almost forgot it was an act. I sat beside her, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "They're inside. Everything's set. Just a little longer." She opened her eyes, just a crack, and gave me the smallest nod. Downstairs, the house buzzed with noise. Dolores shouting for Maria. Richard opening and slamming cabinet doors, complaining that there wasn't enough wine. Mallory cackling about the idiots they'd met on their trip. And Clarissa. Clarissa's heels clicked sharply against the marble as she paced the living room, barking instructions about luggage, about dinner, about meetings scheduled with the family lawyer. The Empire was gathering its forces. They thought this was just another return to the fortress, another tightening of their grip around Sophie's fragile world. They didn't see the cracks in their walls. They didn't know the foundations had already been rotted from the inside. After an hour of frantic bustling and shouting, the house began to settle. Clarissa retreated upstairs to unpack. Dolores poured herself a heavy glass of brandy. Richard disappeared into his study. Mallory sat at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone, muttering under her breath about some deal falling through. I stayed close to Sophie's door, listening carefully, waiting for the right moment. We had the recordings. We had the documents. We had the lawyer arriving tomorrow. But we needed tonight to go smoothly. One wrong move, one slip, and everything we built could come crashing down. I checked the clock. 9 hours until morning. 9 hours until we were free. I sat by Sophie's bedside, the house creaking and sighing around us, and whispered into the darkness. "We're almost there." And somewhere deep in the heavy silence of that house, I felt it shift. The tiniest, almost imperceptible tilt of fate, moving finally, mercifully, in our favor. Morning broke colder than usual, the sky outside a flat, steel gray, like even the sun was holding its breath. I barely slept. I paced Sophie's room long after midnight, listening to the occasional murmur of voices downstairs, my body too tense to rest, my mind replaying every possible outcome, every way this could blow up in our faces. By 6 o'clock, I was already dressed, sitting stiffly in the armchair by Sophie's bed while she dozed fitfully. When the first knock came at the front door, a hard, deliberate rap, I jumped to my feet. This was it. I pressed Sophie's hand once, lightly, and left her room without a word, closing the door behind me. I took a breath at the top of the stairs, steeling myself, then descended, forcing my face into that neutral, harmless expression they all expected. Dolores was already up, still in her silk robe, clutching a coffee mug in one hand and irritation in the other. "Who the hell is knocking at this hour?" she snapped as she crossed the foyer. I beat her to the door, pulling it open just enough to reveal Helena Brooks standing there, sharp as a scalpel in a dark blue suit, a leather briefcase dangling from one hand. "Miss Brooks," I said, stepping aside. Dolores narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "Who's this?" Helena offered a smile so thin it could have sliced glass. "Trust attorney for Sophie Turner. Here to conduct an independent evaluation." Dolores bristled, her mouth opening for a protest, but Helena brushed past her like she wasn't even there, her heels clicking briskly across the marble. "What evaluation?" "We already have a doctor coming today," Dolores barked, trailing after her. "Yes, and I'm sure he's on your payroll," Helena said without missing a step. "I'm here at Sophie's request." That stopped Dolores cold. She turned to me, fury flashing in her eyes. I shrugged innocently. "Sophie asked for her lawyer. I didn't think it was my place to refuse." Dolores spluttered, but Helena was already moving toward the sitting room. She set her briefcase on the coffee table with a decisive thud. "Gather everyone," she said, her voice low and lethal. "Now." Dolores hesitated, then turned on her heel and stormed off, shouting for Clarissa, Richard, and Mallory. I exhaled slowly. The match had been struck. The fire was about to start. Within minutes, they assembled, groggy but curious. Clarissa looked stunning even in her disheveled state, but there was something brittle in her expression now, like a vase that had been dropped too many times and was about to crack. Richard scowled openly, crossing his arms over his chest. Mallory fidgeted, pretending to scroll on her phone but not really seeing the screen. Helena opened her briefcase and methodically laid out files, documents, and a small digital recorder. "I'm here regarding Sophie Turner's trust and well-being," she said coolly. "As per the conditions set forth by her grandfather's original estate plan, I have the authority to conduct an unscheduled evaluation if credible concern arises about her welfare." Dolores scoffed. "This is ridiculous. She's under excellent care. Better than she deserves, frankly." Richard grunted in agreement, while Mallory muttered something under her breath about overstepping boundaries. Helena didn't flinch. "I have credible evidence," she said calmly, lifting a manila folder, "that suggests otherwise." Clarissa's face paled a shade. Helena pressed play on the recorder. The room filled instantly with Dolores's own voice. "As soon as she turns 18, it'll be ours. Keep her sick a little longer. Make sure no one talks to her." Clarissa's laugh echoed next, clear and cold. "If she accidentally gets worse, well, that's a risk we're willing to take." Mallory's cackling agreement. Richard's low, rumbling approval. Silence fell like a hammer. Dolores's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. You can't use that." Richard barked, his face reddening. "It's illegal to record people without consent." Helena arched an eyebrow. "Actually, in this state, recording conversations inside a shared residence does not require consent from all parties if one party is present or aware. Mr. Turner lives here, does he not?" All eyes turned on me. I smiled slightly. "I do." Clarissa took a step forward, hands outstretched. "Gavin, listen, this is all a misunderstanding. We were just talking. It wasn't serious." "Really?" I said, tilting my head. Because it sounded serious. Helena wasn't finished. She pulled out the forged medical records next. Financial statements showing money siphoned from Sophie's trust into personal accounts. Lists of unauthorized purchases. Hospital bills for treatments Sophie never received. "This is enough to bring charges of fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation," Helena said crisply. "Child Protective Services and law enforcement have already been notified. They'll be arriving shortly." Dolores lunged forward suddenly, her face twisted in desperation. "We can make a deal." Helena stepped back coolly. "You had your chance." Richard tried blustering. Mallory tried crying. Clarissa tried seduction, her voice dropping into the soft, pleading tone she used to use on me when she wanted something. None of it worked. They were trapped. They knew it. I watched it happen, the slow, dawning horror as they realized the empire they built wasn't just cracking. It was collapsing. The doorbell rang again. This time, it was the police. Helena moved smoothly toward them, presenting the evidence folders like a general handing over war trophies. The officers moved quickly, efficiently. Statements were taken. Rights were read. Richard was the first to be handcuffed, his face purple with rage. Dolores screamed about wrongful treatment and lawsuits, but the officers ignored her. Mallory sobbed into her manicured hands. Clarissa simply stared at me, disbelief warping her once beautiful face. I met her gaze evenly, feeling nothing but the clean, sharp freedom of justice finally served. As they were let out one by one, Sophie came to the top of the stairs, her small frame illuminated by the cold morning light. She looked down at them, not with fear, not even with hatred, with pity, because despite everything, she was still better than them. And now, finally, she was free. And so was I. The dust didn't settle immediately. The day after Clarissa, Dolores, Richard, and Mallory were led out of the house in handcuffs, the house itself felt different. Lighter somehow, even though the ghosts of their cruelty still lingered in the corners. Sophie stayed curled up in her room most of that first day, exhausted, stunned by the weight of it all. I let her have her space. She had fought harder and braver than anyone ever should have to at her age. She deserved a world of peace now, not more demands, not more fear. While she slept, I started dismantling the life Clarissa and her family had built around me, piece by piece. First, I called my lawyer, Mr. Conrad Wells, a man with a spine made of steel and a reputation for tearing fraudulent marriages apart with surgical precision. Conrad didn't waste time. He drew up the divorce papers that same afternoon, citing fraud, emotional abuse, financial conspiracy, and endangerment. He made sure to attach copies of the evidence Helena had secured. He filed the paperwork under emergency provisions, guaranteeing that Clarissa wouldn't have time to hide or liquidate assets. The message was clear. I wasn't asking for freedom. I was taking it. While Conrad worked his magic, Helena helped arrange for Sophie's care. The court appointed an independent guardian, not family, not anyone connected to the Turners' tangled mess. A woman named Karen Whitley, an attorney with a reputation for being fiercely protective of her young clients. Karen met Sophie 2 days after the arrests. She sat beside her, not towering over her, and spoke to her, not about her. Sophie's shoulders relaxed slightly for the first time in weeks, and I knew we'd made the right choice. Sophie wouldn't be alone anymore. Not until her 18th birthday. Not ever again if I could help it. Meanwhile, Clarissa tried to reach me. From her holding cell. Through tear-streaked voicemails. Through emails sent from burner accounts. Through friends of friends who still somehow thought I could be convinced to understand or forgive. I ignored every single message. Conrad advised me to change my number, but I kept it the same, deliberately, so I could collect every attempt she made to reach me as additional evidence of harassment if needed. I didn't respond. Not once. The silence was louder than any words I could have thrown at her. Within 2 weeks, the preliminary hearings began. Dolores tried to claim that she was misled by Richard and Mallory. Richard tried to blame Dolores and Clarissa. Mallory sobbed about being manipulated by everyone else. Clarissa tried to paint herself as the tragic wife trapped in a toxic family, a victim herself. The judge wasn't buying it. Not after listening to their recorded conversations. Not after reviewing the financial theft and the planned accidents they'd whispered about when they thought no one could hear. The criminal trials were scheduled for the fall. Clarissa's lawyer tried to negotiate with Conrad, offering a quiet, no-fault divorce in exchange for a gracious settlement. Conrad laughed in their faces. I walked away with every cent I earned post-marriage intact. Every promotion, every investment. The house? Sold it. Clarissa had no claim. Thanks to the airtight prenup I hadn't even remembered existed, a document I had signed at her insistence before we married, when she thought she was protecting herself. Irony had a cruel, perfect sense of humor. I used part of the proceeds from the house sale to buy a small place by the lake. A modest 2-bedroom cabin with creaky floors, wide windows, and a view of the water so still it looked like a painting. No marble floors. No cold designer furniture. No hallways filled with silent disapproval. Just peace. I spent my days fixing it up, sanding down the old porch rails, repainting the living room walls in soft, warm colors, setting up a small studio in the spare room where I could finally dust off my guitars. Music returned to my life like an old friend. Not because anyone expected it. Not because it earned me points, but because it made me feel alive again. Sophie visited often. Karen brought her on weekends, and she would sit on the back porch with me, her feet swinging over the edge, her laughter growing louder each time she visited. She was healing. We both were. There were still hard days. Days when the memories clawed at me, when I wondered how I had let myself be twisted into something so small for so long. But more often now, there were good days. Clear days. Honest days. Days when I remembered that love wasn't supposed to feel like sacrifice without end. It was supposed to feel like building something together, not bleeding yourself dry for people who only ever saw you as a means to their own comfort. One evening, as the sun sank low over the lake, Sophie sat beside me, sketching in a battered notebook she had brought from her foster home. "You ever think about going back?" she asked softly, not looking up from her drawing. "Back where?" I asked. "To them." I shook my head immediately. "No," I said simply. "Some doors aren't meant to be reopened." She nodded thoughtfully, flipping to a fresh page. I watched her for a long moment. This strong, stubborn girl who had trusted me when she had every reason not to. And I felt something settle in my chest. Not revenge, not bitterness, just peace. The kind you fight for, the kind you earn. And as the last light disappeared beyond the water's edge, I realized something. I didn't just survive Clarissa and her family. I reclaimed myself, and I would never, ever give it up again. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I was sitting on the porch, tuning an old guitar I had found at a secondhand shop in town. The sun was warm against my face, the breeze off the lake carrying the faint smell of pine and fresh water. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about the past. I wasn't haunted by what Clarissa or Dolores or Richard had done. I wasn't replaying old arguments or broken promises. I was simply living. Then the knock came. It was soft at first, almost timid. For a second, I thought it was a delivery, a neighbor maybe, needing a favor. I set the guitar down and made my way to the door, wiping my hands on my jeans. The moment I pulled it open, the past came flooding back. Clarissa stood there, and behind her, a step back, was Dolores. They looked nothing like the polished, untouchable figures who once floated through grand foyers and exclusive country clubs. Clarissa's hair was limp, her makeup smudged as though hastily applied and even more hastily forgotten. Dolores wore no pearls today, no silk scarf, just a faded cardigan, her face lined with more than age now. It was shame and desperation, and something else I hadn't seen on either of them before. Fear. Clarissa blinked rapidly, like she wasn't sure if she was really seeing me, standing solid and calm in the doorway of a life they no longer controlled. "Gavin," she breathed, her voice cracking. "Please, can we talk?" I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let the silence stretch, heavy and uncomfortable. Dolores was the first to crack, her mouth pulling down into a tight grimace. "We made mistakes," she said, as if mismanaging millions, drugging a child, and conspiring to commit fraud were small errors of judgment. "We know that. But we're family, Gavin. We can fix this." I almost laughed. Family. The words sounded so foreign coming from her that for a second I wondered if she even remembered what it meant. Clarissa stepped forward, her hands twisting together nervously. "Everything's gone," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. "The money, the house, Richard's business, it's all collapsed. People won't even take our calls anymore." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms, letting them say every pathetic word they thought might move me. Clarissa's eyes filled with tears. Real ones this time, maybe. Or maybe just another performance. It didn't matter anymore. "I lost my job," she said, her lip trembling. "My friends. Everything. I didn't realize what I was doing. I was scared. I let them control me too." Dolores cut in sharply, impatient now. "You could help us, Gavin. If you wanted to. You have resources, connections, a clean reputation. People still respect you." Clarissa gave a desperate, wet laugh. "We just need a second chance. Please." For a moment, a sliver of the old me stirred. The man who would have bent over backwards for these people, who would have swallowed every ounce of dignity just to feel accepted, appreciated. But that man was gone. He had been buried alongside my broken dreams the day they abandoned me without a second thought. I looked at Clarissa, really looked at her, and I saw her for what she was. Not some cruel mastermind, not some helpless victim, just a woman who made a choice. Again and again and again, she chose herself, her comfort, her image, her greed. And now that the consequences had come due, she wanted me to pay the bill. I pushed the door open a little wider, not to let them in, but to make sure they saw what was behind me. The lake, sparkling under the afternoon sun. The small, honest life I had rebuilt with my own two hands. The freedom that could never belong to them. "I wish you well," I said, my voice calm. Steady, unshakable. "But you're not welcome here." Clarissa flinched like I'd struck her. Dolores stiffened, her face contorting into that familiar mask of disdain. the one she used whenever she couldn't get her way. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. I smiled. For the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't bitter. It was pure. "No," I said. "I made a mistake once. I let you into my life. I won't do it again." Clarissa reached out, one last pathetic grab for the past. "Gavin." I stepped back and closed the door in their faces. Not with anger. Not with hate. With peace. I stood there for a moment, listening as their muffled voices faded down the porch steps. I didn't watch them leave. I didn't need to. I had already left them behind a long time ago. When I turned back toward the living room, Sophie was standing there, a glass of lemonade in her hand, her head tilted slightly in silent question. "They're gone," I said simply. She smiled, a real, unburdened smile, and handed me the second glass she'd been holding. We walked out onto the porch together, settling into the old rocking chairs I had fixed up myself. The sun was lower now, casting long, golden beams across the water. "You okay?" Sophie asked. I took a slow sip of lemonade, letting the moment stretch and settle inside me. "Better than okay," I said. "I'm free." And I was. Free from their chains. Free from the hollow life I had built trying to please people who never loved me. I had my life back. And this time, it was mine alone to live. The lake stretched out in front of us, endless and calm. The future was wide open. And for the first time in years, I was ready to step into it without fear, without regret. Ready to build something real. Something mine. And nothing would ever take that from me again.